July 17, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy cast long shadows across fields still scarred by the fury of D-Day. In a makeshift encampment near St. Lo, beneath the camouflage netting draped over their Panzer IV, Obergefreiter Klaus Reinhardt and his crew sat cleaning the breech of their 75mm gun. The metallic rasp of the cleaning rod against steel formed a rhythm they knew better than breathing. Reinhardt's hands, calloused, blackened with gun oil, moved with the precision of a man who had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front. Around them, the Norman countryside bloomed with wildflowers that seemed obscene in their indifference to war. The air smelled of summer hay and cordite, that peculiar perfume of occupied France. In the distance, the rumble of engines, always engines, echoed across the bocage. American engines. Reinhardt smiled as he worked, that knowing smile of the veteran, and said to his gunner what tankers across the Wehrmacht were saying that summer. "Let them come with their tin cans. We'll crack them open like eggs." They had earned that confidence. For 3 years, German armor had carved through Soviet T-34s and British Cromwells with a superiority that bordered on contempt. The Panzer IV, the Tiger, the Panther. These were not merely tanks but instruments of a martial philosophy that had dominated armored warfare since the Blitzkrieg shattered Poland in 35 days. German tank doctrine emphasized firepower, armor protection, and superior optics. Their 75mm and 88mm guns could penetrate enemy armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Their crews were trained in combined arms tactics that had been refined in the crucible of Operation Barbarossa, where they had destroyed over 20,000 Soviet tanks. When American Sherman tanks first appeared in North Africa in 1942, German tankers had assessed them with professional interest and arrived at a dismissive conclusion. The M4 Sherman, with its 75mm gun and riveted armor, was inferior in nearly every measurable category. Its armor, barely 76mm at the thickest point, could be penetrated by German guns at over 1,000 meters. Its own guns struggled to damage a Panther frontally even at point-blank range. Wehrmacht intelligence reports circulated among Panzer divisions in France that summer documented these deficiencies with clinical precision. The Americans, it seemed, had brought quantity to a fight that demanded quality. But there was something else in those intelligence reports, something that made veteran commanders pause even as their crews laughed. The Americans were landing tanks in numbers that defied comprehension. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. In the 6 weeks since D-Day, over 3,000 Sherman tanks had rolled off landing craft onto the beaches of Normandy. Behind them, across the Atlantic, American factories were producing tanks at a rate of 2,000 per month, more than Germany could manufacture in an entire year. This was not warfare as the Wehrmacht understood it. This was industrialized combat on a scale that belonged to a different kind of nation, a different kind of war. But numbers alone do not win tank battles, the veterans assured themselves. The Eastern Front had taught them that Soviet numerical superiority meant nothing against superior German tactics and technology. A single Tiger tank near Leningrad had once destroyed 22 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. The mathematics of armor warfare favored the hunter, not the herd. So when American tank columns appeared in the Norman hedgerows that July, German crews went to work with the methodical confidence of craftsmen practicing a known trade. The first engagements seemed to confirm everything. Near Villers-Bocage, a single Tiger I commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann had ambushed a British armored column, destroying 25 tanks and 28 other armored vehicles in 15 minutes. The wreckage burned for hours, black smoke rising like funeral pyres into the summer sky. When Shermans encountered Panthers in the open fields south of Cannes, the results were similarly one-sided. German after-action reports recorded Shermans brewing up, the tanker's grim euphemism for the catastrophic fire that engulfed a penetrated tank, at ranges where American guns couldn't even scratch German armor. The Sherman's propensity to catch fire when hit, caused by its gasoline engine and stored ammunition, earned it a nickname among German crews, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan promised, "Lights first time, every time." Among American crews, grimmer names emerged: Tommy Cooker, Purple Heartbox, Death Trap. The men who climbed into Shermans each morning knew the mathematics of survival. Allied studies would later conclude that a Sherman had roughly a 40% chance of brewing up when penetrated. Crew survival rates were correspondingly grim. And yet they came. Every morning, more Shermans. More American crews with faces too young and accents too varied. farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, the sons of Italian immigrants and Irish laborers and freed slaves. They came in numbers that made killing them feel not like victory but like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Reinhardt first sensed something was wrong not through what he saw but through what he heard. It was July 25th, late morning, and his Panzer IV was positioned in a tree lean overlooking the Purrier-St. Lo road. Intelligence had reported an American buildup, and his platoon had been ordered to interdict any breakthrough attempt. The day was overcast, clouds hanging low like a gray wool blanket. Then came the sound, distant at first, a drone that Reinhardt's mind initially registered as thunder. But thunder doesn't build. Thunder doesn't grow until it becomes a physical pressure against your eardrums, until it vibrates in your chest cavity, until it drowns out every other sound in the world. Reinhardt climbed halfway out of his commander's hatch and looked north. The sky was filling with aircraft. Not the scattered flights he'd seen before, not the tactical strikes that preceded infantry assaults. This was something biblical. Wave after wave after wave of bombers. B-17 flying fortresses. B-24 liberators. Nearly 1,500 heavy bombers stretching from horizon to horizon. Behind them came medium bombers, fighter bombers, close air support aircraft in numbers that blotted out the sun. The bombing lasted for over an hour. Not sporadic. Not tactical. Systematic annihilation of a 5-mile-wide section of the German line. The earth itself seemed to liquefy under the impact of over 4,000 tons of bombs. Trees that had stood since Napoleon's time disintegrated. Stone farmhouses that had sheltered families for generations simply ceased to exist. German soldiers in prepared positions, men who had survived Stalingrad, men who knew what artillery could do, found themselves subjected to violence of an entirely different order. The Panzer Grenadiers of Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite units, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation. 70% casualties in an hour. Survivors emerged from their bunkers, those few bunkers that still existed, with blood running from their ears, unable to hear, unable to think, many unable to remember their own names. The concussion had liquefied their brains. American forward observers, watching through binoculars from positions miles away, reported that the landscape had changed. Roads had disappeared. The bocage hedgerows that had channelized and slowed the Allied advance for 6 weeks had been erased. In their place lay a moonscape of overlapping craters where nothing lived and nothing could hide. Reinhardt's tank had been far enough from the main impact zone to survive, but not far enough to escape the realization that settled over him like frost. This wasn't war. This was an industrial process. The Americans weren't trying to defeat the Wehrmacht, they were manufacturing its absence. When the bombing ceased and his ears stopped ringing, he heard a new sound, the roar of engines, hundreds of engines, American engines, advancing through the gap the bombers had carved. The breakthrough had begun. In the days that followed, American armored divisions, the 2nd and 3rd Armored, the 4th and 6th Armored, poured through the breach at Cobra like water through a shattered dam. They moved not in the cautious, methodical advances that had characterized the Normandy fighting, but in sweeping armored columns that resembled the blitzkrieg tactics Germany had pioneered. Except these Americans did it with a weight of metal that made German operations look like knife fights. For every German tank in Normandy that summer, the Allies fielded 5. For every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every round of ammunition, the disparity was worse. But it was the aircraft that transformed German tankers' understanding of their situation. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug, as American pilots called it, became the sound of German armor dying. The Thunderbolt was not an elegant aircraft. It was a massive, brutish machine built around a 2,000-horsepower radial engine, weighing nearly 8 tons fully loaded. It carried 8.50 caliber machine guns and could be equipped with bombs, rockets, or the M10 rocket tubes that tank crews learned to fear above all else. The sight of a Thunderbolt beginning its attack run, that characteristic diving angle, the sound of its engine climbing to a scream, the ripple flash of rocket launch, became the last thing many German tankers saw. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets could penetrate the top armor of any German tank, where the armor was thinnest. A direct hit would send a jet of superheated metal through the crew compartment at hypersonic velocity. Death was instantaneous, but the tank would burn for hours. By late July, German tank columns couldn't move during daylight. Not safely. Not at all, if they wanted to survive. The Thunderbolts flew in what the Americans called cab ranks, aircraft stacked at different altitudes, waiting for ground controllers to direct them against targets of opportunity. Response time from radio call to rocket impact could be under 3 minutes. German after-action reports from this period make for grim reading. They document a kind of hunting, systematic and patient. American forward air controllers would identify German armor concentrations, even single tanks attempting to move between positions. Within minutes, Thunderbolts would arrive. The term fighter bomber appeared increasingly in German casualty reports, often accompanied by phrases like total loss and crew killed. On August 7th, Reinhardt's division received orders for a counterattack. Operation Luttich, Hitler's personally directed attempt to cut off the American breakthrough and drive to the coast at Avranches. It was madness, and every officer from divisional commander down to platoon leader knew it. The Americans controlled the air absolutely. Moving armored columns in daylight was suicide. But orders were orders, and the German army still functioned on the principle that orders from above were to be obeyed without question, even when those orders came from a Führer who had never commanded troops in battle and whose understanding of military reality had become increasingly detached from anything resembling sanity. Reinhardt's battalion moved out before dawn, hoping to reach their assault positions under cover of darkness. They didn't make it. As dawn broke on August 8th, they were still moving through rolling countryside near Mortain, their columns spread out along narrow roads that offered no concealment. The morning was clear. Perfect flying weather. The Thunderbolts found them within an hour. Reinhardt would later tell interrogators that the attack seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Thunderbolts diving from the sun, more Thunderbolts coming in low over the trees, their wing-mounted guns flashing, the roar of their engines mixing with the shriek of rockets and the concussive thuds as bombs walked through his column. He saw the tank ahead of him, a Panther that had survived 2 years of combat, take a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. The tank simply lifted off the ground, rotated in midair like a toy thrown by an angry child, and came apart. The turret landed 50 meters away. The chassis burned where it fell. Reinhardt screamed for his driver to get off the road, to find any cover, but the hedgerows that had once provided concealment now offered only the illusion of protection. The Thunderbolt pilots had been doing this for months. They knew where tanks hid. They knew to look for the exhaust signature, the heat shimmer from engines, the barely visible shadow beneath camouflage netting. They had all the fuel they needed to loiter, to hunt, to wait for their target to make the smallest mistake. Reinhardt's tank made it to a small grove of trees. They shut down the engine, hoping the thermal signature would dissipate, hoping the aircraft would move on to other targets. For 20 minutes, they sat in absolute silence, listening to the war happening around them. The scream of aircraft engines, the crump of explosions, the occasional secondary detonation as a penetrated tank's ammunition cooked off. Then they heard it, the particular sound of a P-47's engine in a shallow dive, growing louder. Reinhardt looked up through the grove's thin canopy and saw it. A Thunderbolt, no more than 200 meters up, wings already sparking with rocket launch. He had perhaps 2 seconds to register what was happening. The rockets, 4 of them, leaving contrails of white smoke, arced down with terrible. After the breakout from Normandy, Reinhardt's war became a long retreat punctuated by brief, desperate defensive actions that could do nothing but delay. He ended the war in a POW camp in Belgium, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, that final spasm of German offensive capability, launched with armor that had been hoarded for months, fueled by gasoline reserves that represented the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserves. The offensive failed, and when American Thunderbolts returned after the weather cleared, they found German tank columns stranded without fuel, crews sitting beside their Panthers and Tigers waiting for capture because walking home was impossible and dying in place seemed pointless. In the POW camp, Reinhardt and thousands of other tankers had time to reflect. They were fed, not lavishly, but adequately, certainly better than German civilians were eating in the war's final winter. Red Cross parcels arrived with a regularity that seemed magical to men whose own logistics had collapsed. The parcels contained chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, canned goods. Small things. But to men whose nation was starving, these small things represented an economic capacity that made Germany's war effort look like poverty. Some prisoners refused to believe it. They convinced themselves that this abundance was concentrated in the camps, that American civilians must be suffering as Germans suffered. But others, the thoughtful ones, understood they'd been fighting an enemy whose capacity they'd never correctly assessed. In the decades after the war, historians would parse the numbers with academic precision. They'd document that America produced 88,410 tanks during the war compared to Germany's 67,429. They'd note that American industry manufactured 324,750 aircraft against Germany's 189,307. They'd calculate that American GDP increased by 65% during the war while German GDP, even accounting for conquered territories, barely grew at all. But numbers alone don't capture the psychological impact on men who believed in German superiority and then watched the sky fill with thunderbolts. Those men carried home a lesson that transcended mere statistics. Ideology cannot triumph over industrial capacity, cannot substitute for resources, and a nation that must choose between guns and butter will always lose to a nation that can afford both. The Wehrmacht's armor doctrine had been sound. Their tanks were, in many ways, superior. Their crews were often better trained. But they'd brought a craftsman's precision to an industrial war, and precision loses when the enemy can afford to be wasteful. The sound of Thunderbolt engines, that particular radial engine roar, growing from a distant drone to an overwhelming scream, haunted German veterans for decades. It appeared in memoirs, in letters, in the quiet moments when old men remembered what it meant to be hunted from the air without recourse. That sound had signified not just death but irrelevance. It meant that individual courage was meaningless, that tactical brilliance couldn't compensate for strategic bankruptcy, that Germany had entered a fight against an enemy whose capacity for violence was limited only by choice, not capability. The Americans, they learned, could have killed them all and still had resources to spare. That truth was more devastating than any military defeat. It meant the war had been lost not in 1944, not even in 1941 when Hitler declared war on America, but somewhere in the decades before, when Germany chose fascism's disciplined poverty over democracy's chaotic abundance. In the end, Reinhardt and his generation carried home not just defeat but a deeper understanding. They'd laughed at American armor because they'd measured it by the wrong metrics. They'd looked at the Sherman's armor plate and gun caliber without considering the factories that produced them, the supply chains that maintained them, the economic system that made it all possible. They'd fought with the confidence of men who believed that quality would triumph over quantity, that superior will could overcome material disadvantage. And then the sky had filled with thunderbolts, and they'd learned that abundance is its own kind of excellence. That a nation which can afford to be wasteful, which can field adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers, which can feed its soldiers and its civilians while producing a tsunami of war material. Such a nation does not need perfect tanks. The German tankers who survived came home to a nation destroyed, where cities were rubble and children starved and the promised 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. In the prison camps and then in the ruins of Germany, they had time to understand what they'd fought against. Not just the Americans, though the Americans had beaten them, but the entire premise of American power, that free people, working for wages, building things to sell, could generate more collective strength than any amount of totalitarian discipline. The laughter had died somewhere in the Norman bocage, silenced by the scream of aircraft engines and the thud of rockets finding their marks. In its place grew a harder wisdom. That mockery is the luxury of the ignorant, that technological superiority is meaningless without the industrial base to sustain it, and that when the sky fills with your enemy's aircraft, when their tanks outnumber yours 5-1, when their soldiers eat better than your civilians, you are not merely losing a battle. You are learning that you chose the wrong side of history. The Thunderbolt itself, that massive, graceless aircraft, became in memory something more than a weapon. It was the ambassador of a different kind of nation, one that fought without desperation, that wielded power without rage, that could afford to be merciful because it had never feared defeat. The German tankers had expected to face worthy opponents, soldiers like themselves, and instead they'd encountered something more demoralizing, an industrial system wearing a uniform. They'd brought a warrior's code to a factory's war, and the factory had buried them in output. So the laughter died in Normandy, there beneath the summer sky that had betrayed them by filling with the sound of American engines, with the silhouettes of aircraft arriving in waves that made resistance seem not heroic but merely futile. The men who'd climbed into Panzers believing in German superiority learned a lesson that transcended military doctrine, that abundance defeats excellence, that quantity has a quality all its own, and that when you hear the sky filling with thunderbolts, you are not just hearing your own death approaching. You are hearing the future, and it belongs to those who can afford to build 1,000 aircraft where you can build one, who can waste on war and still grow wealthy, who fight not with desperation but with the casual confidence of a nation that knows it cannot lose because it has already won the only contest that matters, the contest of capacity, of production, of turning labor and resources into power so overwhelming that courage becomes irrelevant. And in the end, that was the truth the sky full of thunderbolts taught, that wars are not won by heroes but by factories, not by will but by wealth, not by those who fight best but by those who can afford to keep fighting until the enemy has nothing left to fight with. The German tank crews had laughed at American armor. The sky had answered with thunder, and the laughter had died and would never return.